Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel. And today we're going to be starting another little mini series of videos where we look over the Merkava line of vehicles in the Israeli tech tree. Now this is kind of a companion video to the Megoks, and I imagine the Merkavas, as a pretty popular tank and a pretty unique tank, are one of the big draws for the Israeli tech tree in general. So we're going to go over a lot of basic features for them in this video and cover some of the initial models, and then in the next video we'll cover the later models and really what makes them different. All told, Israel has 8 different Merkavas across the 7 in the tech tree and the 1 premium, but this does bring up an interesting point of discussion, and that is the 3 American Merkavas. Now, the Merkava as a popular vehicle was actually added before Israel was in the game, and because of this they had to find somewhere to put it, and in this case they added all of them to the US tree. These Israeli event vehicles aren't really available right now unless you want to shell out a pretty good sum of money on the Gaijin marketplace, or you feel like just randomly rolling in loot boxes whenever they show up in those. So we won't really be covering that much because they're kind of inaccessible for the average player, but we might touch on them if there are some notable differences. And just to get some basic bookkeeping out of the way, all the Merkavas are fairly modern vehicles, so they all have access to some of the basic stuff that you would know and love from top tier. These are things like fully stabilized guns. The gun will be stable at any speed. They also have access to thermal imaging, so you can easily pick out targets even in cluttered environments. They all have laser rangefinders, so you can easily laze and hit targets even at very long ranges. And they all have laser warning receivers, which is a nice handy touch because you know when you're being lased by things like helicopters or even other tanks. So overall, this is a nice suite of attributes, and it's really nice for every tank to have them. Now you'll probably notice the title of the episode is Hidden Features, and that's because all of the Merkavas have a bunch of somewhat obscure features that are not immediately apparent unless you start playing them. And the first one we're going to go into is the smoke grenade launchers. All variants of the Merkava feature a 60mm mortar. Now in real life this can be used to fire things like high explosive shells, illumination cells, whatever. In game these essentially function as a smoke grenade launcher, and you can even see this on the tank itself. On the Merkava 1 you can actually see it mounted to the side of the turret, however the commander had to get out of the vehicle to fire those, so on later models it's actually in the turret itself and you can see it kind of poking out of the top. These features are pretty useful because it's a smoke grenade launcher that you don't have to research the smoke grenade upgrade to actually use, so all Merkavas have access to smoke stock, which is incredibly handy and makes the stock grind for these vehicles a little easier than usual. Now to go over some universal features for the Merkava series, because they are laid out somewhat differently than a normal main battle tank around this battle rating, the Merkavas feature a front-mounted engine, a front-mounted fuel tank. They also have the driver pretty far up front. Additionally, you have the ammo in 2 storage bins to the far left and right on the back of the hull, and you also have a protected stowage bin inside the tank. Additionally, you have additional fuel cells and even some composite armor on some versions on the upper sides of the tank right next to the crew compartment. So one of the big features that you'll notice with this is you have a lot of stuff between the outside of the tank and the crew, and this includes a lot of internal bulkheads that will basically stop all shrapneling, and then if a shell passes through that bulkhead it will create additional shrapneling off of it, but it will be at a slightly different angle. And this is one of the reasons why the Merkavas often seem to be able to just take hit after hit after hit. It's not because the shells are failing to penetrate, it's because they're getting caught on all this extra kind of crap that's put between the outside of the tank and the crew. And this creates an interesting paradox because while the Merkava armor isn't bad, it's not great, and it's never really at the point where you can rely on it stopping incoming shells. However, because a lot of its protection comes from this wonky internal layout where it's hard to necessarily guess where useful shrapneling patterns will come from, the durability of the tank is never useless either. You can fight some really bad tanks and they can one-shot you, or you can fight the best tanks in the game and they can struggle to pen and do reliable damage. Additionally, all of the Merkavas have really weird turrets, and the turrets themselves tend to interface very weirdly with the volumetric system that they do for armor, because in volumetric, if a shell catches multiple plates at the same time, it tends to kind of spaz out a little, and this will lead to non-pens even from some incredibly high penetrating shells around the turret. It's not consistent by any means, and that's kind of the watchword for the Merkava's durability, is that it's basically never consistent. You're never fully protected, but you're never completely vulnerable either. And there's also another interesting detail that was definitely changed at some point, although exactly when I can't say. So the 2 ammo bins in the back of the tank on the left and right used to be basically just normal ammo bins. However, in real life, these are protected ammo bins. They have armored covers around them, and what this used to mean is that just shrapneling wouldn't set them off, but you could still set them off with a direct hit. These have actually been changed to be essentially blowout panels, and I'm not sure if this was an intentional change or if this is some kind of like bug, but currently they basically work like blowout panels to where if ammo is hit in these bends, unless there's a lot of ammo, it's basically just going to cook off and you're going to get a small fire that doesn't really do that much damage. So you can actually take about 20 or so rounds in essentially all of the Merkavas and not have any real fear of a big ammo explosion going off, which is pretty handy, and it is very important to note. One thing that you definitely want to bear in mind when playing all of the Merkavas is because you have a front-mounted engine, a front-mounted fuel tank, and side-mounted fuel tanks, this tank does tend to get set on fire a fair bit, and even with the upgrade to where you start with one fire extinguisher, the fact that you can't replenish them on cap points does negatively affect these tanks more than basically any other vehicle in the game. I had multiple games with vehicles like the Merkava 4s where I was getting set on fire 3-4 times, and the only reason I was not dead is because my teammates helped me out. So you do want to kind of bear that in mind, is that you want to go for the FPE as soon as possible. For our first actual Merkava that we'll be looking at this video, this is the Merkava 1B. This is the very first one you get access to in the tech tree. Although it's not technically the lowest battle rating, the American Merkava 1 actually does lack some features and doesn't have as good of a shell, so it is slightly lower in battle rating, but this is the lowest battle rating that you can currently get access to in the Israeli tech tree. Now, in terms of mobility, this is probably one of the biggest weak points of the 1B compared to all of its sister Merkavas. The 1B has an incredibly bad reverse gear at only around 9 to 10 kilometers an hour, so it's very sluggish in reverse. However, it is also relatively light for its engine, so it's not too bad in terms of the forward mobility, but it is also quite heavy, so if you get soft ground, it tends to operate a lot worse than some of its sister Merkavas. So the big thing to remember with this in terms of mobility is that it can feel a little painful stock, especially in the reverse gear, but when fully upgraded, in forward gears it's fine, but it's never really going to be good in reverse. In terms of protection, it's a lot like all the other Merkavas. It doesn't have any special features. In fact, it has the fewest special features out of them. But it does still often stop shots, or at the very least absorb a shot without suffering critical damage. Now, the Merkava 1B features the same gun as the other two tanks we're going to talk about in this video. This is the Israeli version of the American M68 105mm cannon, and we already mostly covered this gun in the Magok series. To give a long story short, it has essentially the same utility shells. I would broadly recommend taking out a few HESH rounds and a few smoke rounds just in case you need them. The heat rounds are kind of optional once you have access to the HESH rounds. However, if you want like a more complete rundown of the use cases for all those shells, I did cover it a little better in the second video of the Magok series, so feel free to give that a check out. Now, all of the vehicles in this video start with the M111 APF SDS, pens around 337mm of armor. It's perfectly fine. It's not the best, it's not the worst, it's still very usable, but it's not really going to be knocking your socks off, and there are some enemies where you're going to have to land some relatively precise shots with. But that's only your rank 1 APF SDS for these tanks. You actually have a really good rank 4 APF SDS in the M413 that has a maximum pen of over 400mm. This will comfortably deal with most enemies that you'll meet, basically up into max up tiers. You can kind of take on anything. It's a pretty good shell. It was only recently added when they moved them up in battle rating and shuffled the things around a bit, but it does give them a really good punching power, and you're not going to run into a lot of enemies where these tanks will really struggle to pen them, which does couple well with the fact that these tanks do often survive hits, especially to the front of the vehicle. Overall, the Merkava 1B is a pretty capable vehicle. It's relatively forgiving and a nice introduction to the family, even though it does have the drawback of that pretty horrible reverse gear. Next up, we have the Merkava 2B. Now, the big change to the Merkava 2B that you'll immediately notice when you start driving it is that the Merkava 2B has a significantly improved reverse gear at around 20 kilometers an hour. This is noticeably better and makes the tank just feel a lot better in general. However, it does have some add-on armor that also makes it heavier, so it's a little worse in the forward gears. And the add-on armor doesn't really do much outside of protecting from some heat hitting in some areas. So it is a little worse forward, but noticeably better in reverse. so it's kind of a trade-off. Now, one other weird feature about the 2B is that it actually loses the overbarrel 50 cal that every other Merkava has. The overbarrel 50 cal is kind of a unique weapon to the Israeli tech tree, not a lot of nations have it, and what it basically means is that you can always fire a 50 cal even if your commander is knocked out. However, it doesn't necessarily have the traverse or elevation to shoot down helicopters or planes as easily as like a pintle-mounted helicopter, a pintle-mounted 50 cal would, but you don't ever lose access to it, which is usually pretty handy, especially when dealing with some light vehicles that are weak to 50 cals. In terms of the firepower front, the Merkava 2B is effectively identical to the 1B. There aren't any significant changes at all. Overall, the 2B is a nice and welcome upgrade. Not really necessary, and it is foldered, but I do think it is generally worth getting, and it's pretty fun to play. The reverse gear definitely makes it a lot less painful, especially when you get into the tight quarters. So overall, I do find it to be pretty solid. And the last vehicle we're going to run into today, this is the premium Merkava 2D. Now, the Merkava 2D has essentially the same mobility as the 2B. It's a little heavier, so it is going to be a little worse forward, but it does still have that really nice reverse gear. It also comes with an improved armor package, putting the composite armor around the turret, making it a lot more durable, especially to things like heat rounds, which is pretty nice. However, one thing I will note about the Merkava 2D, you might play it and think, this is a hell of a lot heavier than the 2B. Like, it's not just a little heavier, it's a lot heavier. That's because the 2D and one other Merkava we'll talk about later in the next video has a mine protection upgrade. What this does is that it adds additional armor underneath the tank to try and absorb mine damage, which is fine, but currently there are no mines in the game. Never say never. With War Thunder, right, at some point that could be a thing, and this could be a really useful package, but for the time being, this is mostly useless and just adds around 3 tons to the weight. So if you do end up picking up the Merkava 2D Premium, I would definitely recommend deselecting this upgrade. Overall, the Merkava 2D isn't the biggest upgrade in the world, but the extra parts of protection that it adds over the other two actually are pretty noticeable. And as a premium, even though it has no real 9-7 lineup, I would still say it's probably one of the better ground premiums you can get. It's forgiving to use, the protection is generally pretty good, the gun is basically always effective, there's very little you run into that it can't handle. I mean, you could easily grind out the entire tech tree with the Merkava 2D, so it's a pretty solid vehicle if you do feel like getting your hands on it. On the other hand, if you don't, you could easily stick with the regular Merkavas. It's not like it's a completely different play experience, it's just a slightly upgraded one at a slightly higher battle rating. Now, as far as rating the Merkavas, one thing I'm going to get out of the way right away, because otherwise this video would be very redundant, is essentially all of the Merkavas are A-tier tanks. None of them really drop low enough to be B-tier. All of them are pretty forgiving, their guns are always effective, their mobility is good enough, their protection is always relevant. It's hard to put them below A tier, but they all have limiting factors that keep them from going up into S tier. For example, none of them have particularly fast reloads. In fact, when you start getting into the 120 Merkavas, a lot of the reloads are actually pretty slow. Additionally, their protection is never reliable, so you can't really bait shots with them. It's just sometimes you survive and sometimes you don't. And a lot of these factors kind of keep them from peaking up into S tier tanks, except maybe the 3s. We'll go into that a little bit more in the next video, but broadly speaking, I would say basically every Merkava is an A tier tank. I would recommend getting that. I think honestly all of them are kind of worth putting into lineups and building around. I currently have lineups with all of them, so yeah, like, these are just really good tanks. They're fun to play, and if these are the reason you came into the Israeli tech tree, you probably won't be disappointed by it, although the grind getting to them can be a little tedious. And that concludes part 1 of our video. Make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss part 2. I hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun, hope you learned something, especially about some of the more unusual features of the Merkava series, and I hope to see you next time. Have a great day, everybody.